Yeah, it just came to me that Thomas Carlyle, and I'm probably misspelling his name. He wrote an essay back in the 1820s or 1830s. Very, very interesting essay. You can find it on the internet. It may be something that you want to look at to put McLuhan in perspective when you're thinking of writing your essay. It's the signs of the times. It was about industrialization. It was about the changes going on in England as a result of the Industrial Revolution. And he was maybe one of the first people to see or to hypothesize that changes in environment, changes in actually economic changes in the way things are produced, were resulting in changes of consciousness, changes of sensibilities, changes in culture, changes in the way people think. So, which is just to say that this thesis that McLuhan seems to be putting out there, that we live in an entirely new world as a result of modern electric media, is a variation on a fairly old theme. It goes back well into the 19th century. And again, I would say that, again, if you're looking for a real precursor, it's Marx. And Carlyle too, but more prominently Marx's historical materialism, that forms of consciousness change in accord with historical changes, which is part of the general thesis that consciousness itself is historical. That is, there's not one form of human consciousness that we can say is, paradigmatic or natural. It's something that's evolving and changing, which is an interesting thesis. But okay, so I suppose that brings us to certain questions we would have about this thesis that the medium itself will have profound effects on us in terms of ways of thinking, perceiving, imagination, kind of ideas we're likely to have, et cetera, et cetera. Just how is this happening, and what are the changes? Well, let's get to this very interesting idea. Hot and cold media, which is, nobody could ever really figure out. Anybody who reads McLuhan, talks about McLuhan, it's notoriously difficult to figure this one out. Which media are supposed to be hot and which ones are supposed to be cold? Well, let's see if we can make a list here. Now, print is definitely hot. Okay. Radio, I think he says, is hot. Now, I'm probably going to get these wrong too, but it's McLuhan, so he wouldn't take it amiss if we got these things wrong. And maybe the idea itself is a little hazy and unclarified for him. Print is a hot medium. Radio is a hot medium. TV is a cool medium. And one wonders, what's the point of making these metaphorical distinctions between different forms of media and whether they're hot or cool? Well, it has to do with information and it has to do with participation. And that, I think, is a huge element in McLuhan thesis. The idea is that radio and print give us a lot of information, and that we consume them, let's say, or that we experience them in a fairly passive way. That is, all the information is there. It's all sort of defined. The media here are well defined in terms of what they're saying, or how they are presenting whatever it is that they're presenting. But that TV is a cool medium in the sense that it is information starved, in the sense that it's not well defined. It's not finite and limited in the sense that print and radio are. and therefore that we have to participate more fully in it to sort of complete the message. Right? That is, it calls for interpretation, and if it calls for interpretation, it calls for participation. That we don't passively take in TV messages. We have to participate in the thing to sort of complete the message, and I hope that that's not too far from his point. But this notion of participation, especially if you read, if you've read at least parts of The Medium is the Massage, that seemed to be really important. Participation, involvement, and this sort of goes along with his idea of the global village. That is, that television, electric, and this is true of radio too, anything that's sort of simultaneous, that it involves us with everyone, potentially at least. That TV especially is the great unifier in the sense that it connects us up with everyone. People before television knew that there were other people in the world. They read about them. They saw pictures and illustrations of them. They, were aware that other people lived in other places of the world or in other ways, had different beliefs and social structures and economies and art and architecture and ways of dress and all that. People were aware of that. But now, because of the difference in television, we are not only aware of it, we're involved. The kind of connections that we have with others, at least according to McLuhan, are much more vital, much closer. I don't know what would be a paradigmatic instance of this. Perhaps the moon landing in 1969, when it seemed like the whole world was watching when the American astronaut Neil Armstrong stepped down onto the surface of the moon. That made possible a certain global experience that had never been possible before. And certainly, people read newspapers and found out that Napoleon had been exiled or that the war was over or something like that. But it wasn't quite as immediate and intense as, a live television signal showing everyone in the world who had a television and cared to watch that a human being set foot on the surface of the moon. So that we live in a more empathetic world, you might say, where things are delivered to us all at once is really one of the main things. And this sort of participatory, more involved way of thinking or form of living that supposedly electric media have produced in us. He characterizes as mythic, that we live mythically. That this mythic way of experiencing things and thinking about things is an artifact of electronic media, especially television. And this is perhaps the biggest change, I would say, my own judgment that he is suggesting that we're undergoing is that we live mythically. Well, as opposed to what? I suppose the first word that comes to mind as a contrast is to live rationally as opposed to mythically, or rationality, or rational as opposed to mythic. That our notions of rationality, according to McLuhan, are certainly associated with print culture, visual culture. And the idea is that that's changing. We're moving over, making this great change from a print-centered culture to one in which people imagine, think, receive information, communicate in a way that's no longer print.